Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you that are already joining us, welcome to our third session. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, you can find the recordings to the recordings of sessions 1 and 2 of our 4-part webinar on the Cal-HOSA website, which is you can see it on your screen at calhosa.org. And also, if during Dr. Mark Reagan's presentation, if you have any questions that come up, highly encourage you to please write them on the using the chat feature, and we will get them towards the end of the of his presentation. And so, with that, today's session will highlight the remaining 6 struggles and strategies that Dr. Mark started last week. And again, these are in light of how we're navigating the current COVID-19 pandemic. And so at this time, I will now turn it back to Mark for his third session. Mark?
Thank you. Welcome aboard, everybody. Good to see you all. It doesn't feel like just a couple of weeks. To me, it feels like a really long time. So this is the second day of talking about kind of the mental health challenges and strategies from being the shutdown and the COVID. Last week we focused a fair bit on things that are pretty concrete, things like scheduling and sleeping and doing things that were enough enjoyment and exercise. Today we're going to focus more on things that are more almost not necessarily abstract, but more emotional or psychological things along the way. So let's get started. This first one is that, and this was the one that I think got to Anne Frank the most. The first one is that we're stuck living with our families for long periods of time here. And I want to give a little bit of background here, because this would not have been an abnormal situation traditionally for people until reasonably recently. You were stuck with your family for your entire life. You lived in the same village, the same buildings, the same extended families. You spent time learning jobs and housekeeping from your parents. You did the same jobs. You worked in the same businesses they did. You married people that you knew since you were kids. It would have been all right around the same set. But we find this is rather repressive to be with our families, especially if you're a young person. And the reason, because right now we're urging young people not to just follow from their parents and the traditions and stuff that they've learned, but to check out their own passions, your own dreams, your own talents, to create what you want in life, especially for people whose families are immigrant families. Part of the point of coming here was so that the children could have opportunities for lives that the parents didn't have where people came from. They may not be able to visualize what that's supposed to be, but they know you're supposed to be growing in some way beyond where their lives were. Now, the good part of all this is it allows for an amazing amount of diversity and innovation and personal expression. But it's much more difficult to find your own path in all kinds of things than it is to just do what everyone else has always been doing. And what tends to happen to a lot of young people, especially in high school and college age, and then moving forwards, is that you end up with one way you act with your friends that's growing and developing and trying new things, and one way you act with your family that is the way that they expect you to be, or the way that fits in with your family dynamics. And unfortunately, what can happen is the part with your family can end up feeling kind of stuck in the same place while the other part grows and grows, and you can feel torn in two as these things go in opposite directions. I remember years ago when I was about 30, and my boss, who was about 60 or something, was going home for Thanksgiving to Michigan to see her mother, who was probably 80s at the time. And suddenly I saw this lady who was the director of the whole program turn into an insecure, like, teenager. am I dressed okay? Is my mother going to be okay with me? And is it going to be all right? And if she's going to, how is she going to pick on me, or how am I going to get along, sort of things, going home for Christmas? And I wonder myself, does this ever end? Is there a time at which you outgrow this? And the answer is not really, if yourself at home stays stuck at the ages and doesn't grow. And frankly, most parents, even if they want something different or growing for their kids, have a real hard time adapting their kids growing or changing from where they are. This can be big things, it can be little things. This can be especially strong with immigration issues and cultural issues. This can be especially strong with sexual orientation and identity issues. I knew one young man whose family was strictly Muslim from Indonesia. His dad worked in the government, and he is gay. And as he was in college, he was more and more developing a gay identity and enjoying having boyfriends and expressing himself more and more. But that is totally unacceptable with his family and his culture. If they learned that he was gay, his father would lose his job, and they would lose their home and all their friends back home. That it was literally tearing him into two pieces like this. It can have to do with career expectations. It can have to do with religions. All kinds of things can make you tear into two like this. So with that as a background, when you're stuck back with your family, there's two extremes of how you can act when you're in family all the time. One is you can go back to the old way of being as a kid, and you start feeling like you're only 12 again or much younger, and you're watching over the younger children, and you're and you go, why is my mom treating me like this, sort of things. Or the other is you can get to extreme isolation. I'm going to hang out in my room, and I'm not going to go out hardly at all, and stay on my phone and keep my headphones on to avoid getting sucked into these things. Both of these approaches have significant risk for getting depressed, because neither one allows you to express your own growing independent self. What's needed is your parents are likely to always reflect back to you your childhood self, while your peers reflect your emerging selves. You need to retain some peer reflection, some sense of people who see you as growing into this different independent person, and not your parents only or your family members who see you only as part of the family. Remember, rebelling against your parents' point of view isn't the goal. That's the means to the goal of self-expression. Make sure whether you're acting more or less rebellious, or avoiding or fitting in, or trying to be a peacekeeper, that you keep tapping into some of your emerging self-expression. On the other hand, for those of us who are parents and teachers, the goal isn't to get young people to comply and cooperate and get along with us. We're trying to also promote them to keep their self-expression going, even when it isn't what we want them to do, and maybe especially when it isn't what we want them to do. The other thing about being back with families is some families are unfortunately abusive or neglectful about or traumatizing. Sometimes there's nothing post about PTSD. The trauma is actively happening. Some people are living with family members who are violent, family members who are actively substance abusing. They may be living in situations that include physical or emotional or sexual abuse within their households. And they may have, school may have been an escape from this, or a way of now they're more and more isolated with their family. And you might find yourself with more of your coping skills that you've had ever since you were a kid coming back. To give an example of this, I was working with a young college lady who, she's been with her dad, but her older brother, who used to be very physically abusive and beat her up a lot when she was a kid, had to move back home. And he's now at home, and he's smoking a lot of pot, and he's pounding on the walls at home and not working or doing anything, because he can't support himself in this economy. Every time she hears his music or hears him pound on a wall, she goes back to the little kid who was getting beaten up. She goes back to disconnecting and dissociating. She gets spacing out, and it's made it extremely hard for her to focus on any of her studies or to do well in classes at all. She feels back in that way of coping from when she was a kid has gotten stronger and stronger. She's stuck with no other people to be around to keep it separated. this is a time to say you're not actually a kid anymore, even if you're more stuck with your family. Which of these things that you're coping were really helpful and helped you get through? Those are your loyal soldiers, kept you alive through all this stuff, even if other people aren't too keen on them. Things like emotional detachment or cutting or restrictive eating or substance abuse may have kept you alive, but they're also can be self-defeating, problematic in some way. Can you start adapting your survival skills even while you're still within a traumatic family? The main thing to try to do is to avoid isolation, which is, while you're trying to isolate, it's hard to avoid isolation. To keep as contact with other people who see you in other ways, or to have some breaks so you're not always on alert all the time, always feeling that you're having to protect against whatever is going on in your family or having to take care of everybody else. But this can be a time to really bring back old family dynamics, or even just not to give you an escape from the dynamics. All right. Moving on, one of the big problems with this pandemic is how powerless and helpless people feel. Telling everybody you ought to hide out in your house while waiting for someone to create some better testing and treatments and vaccine may be reasonably realistic to have less people die, but it feels terribly powerless. We're just sitting here, can't I do anything? As information has been, originally we wanted more and more information, we can get very much on overload. Ask yourself how much information and which sources are ones that help you and which ones are ones that don't help you. The last couple of points are how you start taking back some power. One is, just because you're medically powerless, just because you can't necessarily avoid getting infected or infecting other people, doesn't mean you're powerless over everything in your lives. You're still able to set and achieve other goals in life. It doesn't have to be you're passive over everything. Just because you might get sick or your grandmother might get sick doesn't mean you can't still do things in your life and still progress. Doesn't mean that everything doesn't mean anything. The world will go on after this. 99+% of people will live. Well, it's very likely you will be part of this. So don't give up your power in everything. Almost paradoxically, one of the best ways to feel less helpless is by helping other people. And I was talking to a young lady who was feeling very isolated, and her church had a group that was reaching out to each other and helping people not feel so isolated while they're at church. And I said, why don't you volunteer to help call some more people? And she said, no, I can't do that. I don't have my act together. I can't reach out to help other people. They were calling out to help me. I can't be helping others. You don't have to have your act together to help other people. You just need to care about them and to want to connect them. If you share your struggles with them, you'll build empowerment both for you and for them. It isn't always necessarily the best to have someone who's powerful and in control helping you. Sometimes two people going through things together who can share their struggles can actually empower both of them along the way. One of the items that may have affected you all who have been in high school the most strongly, and those who got in college, is that you really lost things that you intended to have. What happened? I saw a t-shirt recently that said class of 2020, 1 star. And the review said, and it said a review, the ending was terrible. You lost your graduations, lost your proms, and even besides these ritual things, you may have lost actual things. You may have lost the opportunity to date. You may have lost your first love or sexual relationship developing as it got isolated. You may have lost a summer internship that you were looking forward to. You may have lost a summer job to have money so you could go to college. You may have decided it isn't worth the money to go to a college that no longer has dorms and costs a lot of money. You may have lost that opportunity to leave home and go to faraway college as a result of this. Lots of real things may have gotten lost along the way here. You may have just lost some of your education and didn't learn as much as you should. Now you're going to be further behind in classes coming up. All those are real losses, and and the attitude that says, "Oh, never mind, it's not that big of a deal," is that's not very sensitive. It is a big deal. You lost things that are important, and you should grieve over those losses. However, on the other side, it's unlikely that any of those losses are truly going to damage you or the person you're going to become over the long run if you keep going and you prepare for your future. This is not going to go on for all of your college career. This is not going to go on for the rest of your life. Keep in mind things that you can have as opportunity in the future, even if things end up delayed a year or two because of this. That's not actually the end of the world. I know a year or two is a lot shorter at my age than it is at yours, but we get a lot of extra years. Usually we lose them for things of our own doing. We ended up with some kind of substance abuse, a terrible relationship, a college major goes the wrong direction, a terrible illness, something happens that you lose time along the way, a breakup that you can't get over for a whole year. People take a lot of leaves or withdraw or things and have to get back to it later. This one, similarly, this doesn't mean the end of things. Remember the things that you lost and try to rebuild them into your future. The future might be delayed some, and these opportunities need to be postponed, but you can still grow into the person that you were meant to be. Now, one of the things that's hard about this, we've alluded to this some in the past, is that when you've got a bunch of roles in your life, so you might be, for instance, a son, an older brother, a musician, an aspiring boyfriend, a surfer, a mediocre student, a film aficionado, a pot smoker, a social justice champion. You might be all these things. And then different ones make you feel alive, and different clothes you wear, different friends, different emotions that go with these various things. And now that you're stuck at home and can't be around friends, can't do very many of these things, you find that you've lost roles along the way. It's not that you lost the activity, but you lost that whole mindset, that whole way of being, that whole part of yourself. I just don't feel like I'm a surfer anymore if I can't go to the beach. I don't feel like I'm an aspiring boyfriend if I can't even flirt with anybody or try to get a date. I don't feel like I'm a social justice champion if I'm watching the people demonstrate in the streets and I stay home because I have to protect the health of my elderly parents or grandparents at home. I feel like part of me is getting lost, not just the activity is getting lost. And so it's important to figure out how you can be in those roles even with the limitations. My favorite tragic example of this is Frida Kahlo is perhaps the best Mexican artist ever. She was also married to Diego Rivera, who is arguably the best Mexican artist ever. He was also a terrible womanizer, and she was also in a terrible accident where she had these terrible broken bones and back and terrible pain for all life. So for a good deal of the rest of her life, she was bedbound with a negligent husband. Now, she could have been stuck then, said, all right, my role is to be an invalid. My role is to be a long-suffering wife, and that's all there is to my life. Those are the only roles I can play with all the pain I've got and what I'm stuck with. But as I introduced her and how most people would know her as an amazing artist, she continued to be an artist. She continued to paint things. She put her pain into her paintings. I think that's part of why many people like them a lot, because you can see the raw emotions in these paintings. But she found a way to do it at home rather than going out by herself and get things going. A similar art example is Matisse, when he got very, very old, was bedbound and terribly arthritic, couldn't even lift up a paintbrush. And he would have people moving on the floor around him colored cutouts of various shapes, which are very popular. You've probably seen them in posters and things. So he continued to be an artist even when his life was limited. Even when your life's limited, can you continue to be these roles that are important to you? Even if you can't go out and do something, can you do something that goes with that role to bring out that part of you? So focus especially on your activities, not just busy time, but things that actually how you feel different while you're doing it and how it's a role in your life that you're trying to build. All right. The next one is kind of a positive example rather than a negative one, is about, could you create a personal retreat out of this? So I once did a week-long, almost silent Buddhist retreat. And frankly, it shares a bunch of elements with the pandemic shutdown. Your normal routine is cut off. You're disconnected from the outside world. They actually removed all our electronics and all people are around. You have a different schedule going along. You're isolated. And mostly you have a lot of time for sitting around thinking. And it's very disorienting. They tell people you should only go on retreat for a day or two if you're not used to this or haven't practiced, not for a whole week, let alone we've been doing this for several months now. Many of the struggles of retreats is feeling disoriented is the same as the struggles been experiencing during the shutdown. And unless you're very experienced at a retreat, you wouldn't do it on your own. You would have a guide or a set program. The agenda, yes, it would have things as a schedule. It would keep a schedule going with doing chores and eating and meditation and lectures and things like this, exercise, walking. But it would also have a guide for what the program is you're trying to do, what these lectures are about, things trying to help you with your growth. Now, productive retreats are not just sitting around thinking about nothing. They're actually intentional focus on what you want to grow or what you want to change. When you've got all this space, all this open up. I remember when I first was a retreat for a few days, I said, oh my God, I'm feeling terribly unstable. My mind's going all over the place with all these imaginary weird things happening. And the lecturer was saying, oh, your mind is getting more and more stable and you're feeling peaceful. And I don't think peaceful. I'm feeling like I'm going crazy like this. And it took me a while to say, wait a second, I'm not actually going crazy. What's happening is my mind is feeling more free and untethered than ever before. I've got a lot of space for hours and hours worth of going on whatever kind of mental journeys I felt like. This felt weird and felt unstable and felt crazy, but it actually was a mental freedom. If you've got yourself a whole bunch of time this summer, not much requirements, a lot of time by yourself, a lot of thinking, this can be terribly disorienting, or you can use this as a bunch of mental freedom to grow things in your mind. But you're going to have to come up with some kind of guidance, some kind of program, and you don't have somebody sitting in your living room doing this for you. You're going to have to come up with, I'm going to go through this meditation program that's on the internet and do an hour of it each week and follow the direction of things. I'm going to pull out a adult children of alcoholics or Alateen workbook and go through the pages and the exercises. I'm going to pay attention to gratitudes so that I can build that part of my spirituality. You can do physical things. I'm going to do this yoga practice. I'm going to work out or do different things. My favorite example of this one as an unintentional retreat is, oh, come on, Mark. My brain just went blank. You guys, if you could talk to me, you could tell me what the name is, because it's the leader of South Africa. It'll come to my mind in a few minutes but I'll describe him anyway. The leader of South Africa, when he was a young man.
Mandela?
Thank you. Nelson Mandela, when he was a young man, he was he would do a lot of demonstrations. And he said, peaceful demonstrations aren't going to accomplish anything. We're not going to get anywhere with this racism stuff, this peaceful demonstrations. They'll pretend to change, not actually going to do anything. It's going to go nowhere. So he went to special training that the Russians sponsored for a lot of Africans to learn how to be violent, to learn how to blow up things and fight against the police and the army in order to really bring a revolution to his country. And they caught him really rapidly, and they put him in jail for decades. And while he was there, he used the time to learn more about nonviolent resistance, to learn more about people like Gandhi, in order so that when he finished, he came out to be this incredible leader of achieving more than could have ever been done, not through violent means, and bring South Africa together rather than it turning into a bloody revolution like other places did. He got a whole lot of calmness and peace, and he intentionally developed the nonviolent parts of himself in order to do that. I wouldn't expect you or I to do something that dramatic, but we can do modest things, set a retreat goal, get some tools and guidance, and go for it. See what happens as a positive along the way. All right, last one of the challenges and strategies is that as humans, we find suffering easier to bear if it has a meaning to it or a purpose to it. Why did I have to go through this? God, why did you make this happen to me? Why did it happen? We want to know it's for some meaning that happened. This particular stressor of a coronavirus mutating and infecting people and spreading all over the world is very difficult to come up with any meaning about. At basis, it's a biological phenomenon. It's a predator-prey thing, and we're the prey, and it's the predator. And coronavirus itself is a very difficult enemy to mobilize against. It's very hard to see. It's within us. Even when it's in us, it's hard for us to see. We can be asymptomatic. It's pervasive. And it's very hard to anthropomorphize it, to make it into something. Oh, it's a clever illness, or it's looking for opportunities, or it's not doing any of these things. It's just this little strand of RNA. It doesn't have any mind. It doesn't have any purpose except replicating itself, as all life does. It has some life force, I suppose. It's not intentionally figuring out how to destroy our lungs or how to go after Black people. All the things that we see it doing are predominantly altered by our response to it. How's our immune system? How's our lungs? How aged are we? How is our socioeconomic status? How is our avoidance of other people? How is our crowding? How's our social distancing? What happens is determined by us, not it, actually. So the coronavirus is very difficult to attach meaning, like I'm fighting cancer or something, especially when it's so invisible and hard to see. I mean, you can have meanings like I want to protect my grandparents, I want to protect myself, or stop it from spreading. But it's very difficult for us to get our hands around this. And this is one of the reasons it's very hard to go through this, because why are we doing this? Why are we shutting down? And I think a good deal of our decisions to reopen is that we can't figure out the meaning. It's too hard on this level. There's not much that really makes sense about this. So we're actually seeing ourselves reopening and decreasing the fight. I also think this is somewhat of why the huge popularity of the anti-racial movements spring up now. Not to take anything away from the legitimacy or the pain of what it's going through, is that's a much more meaningful thing to be involved with. It's got great emotional tone to it, and purpose, and social justice, and value, and growing, and you can have great meanings with this, much more so than washing your hands. Coronavirus is very hard to attach much meaning to this. And so this is one of the reasons why I think it's been very hard to deal with this suffering on higher levels of looking for meaning. And you find people arguing in terms of, well, let's just talk about data, let's just talk about survival rates. Or they try to bring in other kinds of meaning things to it. Well, this is actually about freedom. This is actually about destroying Trump's presidency. This is actually about leadership. This is actually about God's will. something else, because just fighting a virus is very hard to get an emotional meaning for us. And that's going to make it hard over the long run to put this suffering in some kind of context, or to put it behind us. Because why did we have all the people die? Why did we shut down? Why do we have this terrible recession? Because of a virus we can't see? That's very difficult to get our heads around. And I want to do a comparison here. The last time we had a virus like this that killed millions of people was as you probably know by now, was in the 1918 Spanish influenza. And there was a great outbreak because on November 11th was Armistice Day. They ended World War I. And there was huge parades in the streets all over America and a great deal of the world celebrating the end of that war. Once again, ending World War I, that's a pretty easy thing to attach meaning to it. We got to end this war and all this killing. It's hard. Why were we in the war in the first place? And what's the purpose of war? Ended up these big issues that continued afterwards. But it's easy for people to go out in the streets and feel great joy at the ending of this war and the relief of people coming back. What they didn't feel was, I have to fight this influenza virus, so tens of thousands of them died as a result. Because it was easier to fight the enemy that had meaning than to fight the enemy that didn't have meaning. So they took extra casualties from influenza that because we were celebrating the war ending. We may be doing something similar with the anti-racial demonstrations. All right, that brings me to my last slide. And this one I put in actually since I made up the slide set a few weeks ago, because it feels like things have changed a fair bit to me. Originally, it felt very much like the shutdown was real and ongoing and merciless, and the main thing we're struggling with along the way. And now we're in the phase of opening. And that's bringing different mental stresses and altering things. And I want to highlight 3 events that have happened along the way. One was the picture on the left there. That's Huntington Beach. That's when the governor in May was closing the beaches there. And there's demonstrations that said, we are free. You got to open things. We're going to go to the beach whether you want to or not. You can't be a fascist and cut us down. This got extremely severe in Orange County. The health director there was threatened badly. She was, they made pictures of her looking like Hitler with a mustache on. This got to the point where the sheriffs had to have a detail to protect her, and she resigned entirely. They made a $75,000 agreement between her and the city that she wouldn't criticize them and they wouldn't criticize her afterwards. And a new health person took over. He was immediately harassed about this as well, and within 2 days he changed it so you don't need to wear masks out in public in Orange County anymore. Now, that one is about a mental stressor that I didn't even think to put in my top 13 things. That how much we love freedom. The desire for freedom has driven all kinds of things all over the world, every place. And it felt like our freedom was being imposed upon by making us stay home and making us do these restrictions. I want to do what I want to do. I want to live free or die. Literally in this case, actually. That I want to be free to do what I want, and if I die doing it, that's what happens. That it turned out that it was a great mental stress to voluntarily give up our freedom for these months, or to feel like someone was taking away our freedoms. Second thing that happened that I've alluded to a few times is the giant anti-racist protests. That's the picture of the one in Hollywood. These people actually are, for the most part, wearing masks, but that's clearly not social distancing. It clearly is a huge risk of spreading as a result. people have lots of different motivations for wanting to be part of those protests and continue to be part of those protests and continue to move the agenda forwards in what's likely to be positive ways. And people wanted to be part of history, wanted to be part of doing something very important. And it's likely that some will get infected because of that, and some will even die as a result of that. Maybe a large sum. We'll see if there turns out to be a spike in cases and deaths. But in the same way that there are no memorials that I'm aware of that said, that's a statute for the people who died so we could celebrate the end of World War I doubt there will be statutes celebrating the people who died so that we could decrease racial violence by demonstrating in the middle of a pandemic. I didn't even know that there were people who died from the pandemic, even though we celebrate November 11th ever since. We call it Veterans Day now, and still has we're still grateful our soldiers have come back alive. We're grateful that soldiers go out and help America's influence around the world. But we don't remember those who died in the pandemic as a result of that day, the first time. And neither do I think it's likely we'll remember those who died from the coronavirus as a result of these protests. And the third picture is of Las Vegas casinos reopening. Now, Las Vegas, to some degree, has always been a place to go to escape from responsibilities, escape from life. It's advertised as irresponsible, if not immoral, pleasures or vacations. I mean, if the definition of integrity is doing the same thing when no one's watching as when people are watching you, then the calling catchphrase for Vegas, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, is urging a break from integrity, a break from your normal ways of being. This is a sheer wanting to escape from responsibility and morality and integrity. And it is very likely that in this case, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas will not happen. There's a good likelihood that Vegas will be one of the largest ongoing centers of distribution of coronavirus all over our country as time goes on and on and on. So we look at these three things together. We've got a desire for freedom. We've got a desire to be involved in other meaningful social activities and movements. We've got a desire to be irresponsible and just leave our worries behind. These sorts of feelings are actually maybe driving the opening up as much as considered decisions about what are the risks of the virus or not. And these are also mental things. How do we handle when our freedom is imposed upon? How do we handle when we see large social movements? And how do we handle the desire to just escape from responsibilities? This phase we're in now of opening up things puts more of the personal decisions on each of us, more of the personal on how we will make these decisions, how we will individually make these responsibilities, what consequences we're willing to face or not willing to face. And it won't be as heavy-handed on the part of the government or the economy shutting them down as a result. And so the individual decision-making, the individual, how well we're managing our mental state may well determine our chance of living or dying altogether as a result of this. That does it for my slides at this point. The fourth, I will open up some questions. I wanted to do a little preview. The fourth session for next week is going to be about the legacy of this, which of course none of us know what it is, none is written. If this is going to be the defining events of your generation, how will they define you? How will they define all of us? And how will we be moving forwards? And so we're going to do kind of, instead of such a defensive and reactive way of looking at things that I brought up the last 2 weeks, how can we look at things in a proactive moving forwards and and getting some meaning and learning from our suffering as a result. I want to stop there and see if we've got some questions along the way here and comments from you guys who've been hanging in with me.
If you have a question, there are three options. One, you can use the chat feature or the Q&A feature, or we're going to invite you to simply unmute yourself and ask the question. But there is one question that was put on the Q&A feature from Prishna, and it reads, coming out of this pandemic, how can one help peers with their mental health?
So I'm trying to think how to, actually, is that person around to say what specifically would you like to be helpful with? Because I can take that question a number of different ways. I want to make sure I'm on your page with it. Is
Krishna,
that person want to unmute yourself and say hi? No, I get to figure this out myself. So actually, let me just make a comment about peer support in that case about this one. Oh, is that Prishna? Oh, here she comes, maybe. You want to say it? Hi?
Hi.
Speak up. How can I direct this answer? What are you most concerned about?
So, like, obviously some people might not be getting the resources that we're getting, especially through this webinar. So I'm wondering how exactly I can help, like, my peers or others around me that might be struggling with mental health issues, especially after arising and dealing with, like, you know, this pandemic and being isolated.
So if I'm getting, again, and you come from the right spot, one is hopefully the same set. One of the reasons I broke it down and all these different things, these 13 different things going through, is so you can look at yourself and you can look at your friend and say, I wonder which one they're struggling the most with. Let me hear what they're talking about. Hey, that sounds a lot like you don't got any pleasurable things going on. That sounds like a lot like you're stuck in your family dynamics. That sounds a lot like you've got helplessness overwhelming you. That sounds a lot like you can't make any meaning out of this. That sounds like you're not getting any exercise. You can use these things to try to help make some kind of formulation or figure out or offer back. But when people come to peers for support, the most powerful thing about peer support is not expertise. It's not, oh yes, let me tell you what I know that you don't know. It's the sharing of things and the listening of things in a non-judgmental way. To be there as someone going through it similarly with them, or maybe not similarly. To be there as a listener. Listening is the number one thing for any kind of support. To be there as a listener, hear what they're saying, be a reflection back, share the things you can, not the ones you can't. Try not to be judgmental. One of the things that connects this question and a question we had at the end last time was, the lady last time said something like, yeah, sure, it'll be good to have a schedule and exercise more, but how do I get myself to do that? And I said, well, it's not just rational, it has to be emotional, try to put some pleasure into it, and often it's easier to do things with someone else too. So one thing as a peer you can do is agree to do something with someone. Let's do this retreat together. Let's together be online while we're doing an exercise thing together. Let's share our screens open while we're doing things. Let's find this thing out together. But I want to make one other point to connect these things is, if you ever try doing something like meditation or yoga, you'll go and you go, oh, I can't do this, it's too hard, or I can't make my brain empty or do this position right or something. And of course you can't do something new the first time and do it right. I remember my mother, I said, you know, you're always so anxious. Why don't you go do some yoga? And she goes to the yoga. She says, oh, I hated that. I couldn't do the positions as good as the other people and stuff. I've got to go back to my normal exercise that I feel I'm good at and I'm competent with and stuff. Every yoga or meditation teacher does not respond with, oh, I don't know what's wrong with you. You do this so badly. What, this position's no good. Didn't you understand the instruction? You're supposed to empty your thoughts. What are you doing with letting them wandering around? They all have this gentle, non-judgmental thing to them about, I get where you're at. Of course you have a monkey brain that drifts all over the place. Of course you can't stay still. It feels uncomfortable. This is way out of your comfort zone. Of course you're just a beginner doing this. Accepting you where you're at and then agreeing to walk forwards with someone is how they all look. And frankly, I think that may be, yes, it's good to learn meditation or yoga, but it's even better to learn how to have that voice inside yourself that's a gentle, accepting, where you're at to help move with you. And that's oftentimes it's easier for us to be that way with our friends than with ourselves. We can't be gentle with ourselves. At the very least, maybe we can be gentle with our friends, and they may not be getting that from themselves. They may not be getting it from parents, and that's something we can bring them, is this extra gentle, accepting voice. And all right, so that's where you're at, and you're all depressed about this and confused and disoriented. I get it, and you want to maybe do something with me that'll help a little bit. Taking that as the stance of peer support.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome, Krishna.
Okay, as we're waiting for more questions or someone to unmute themselves and ask the question, Mark, just a reaction to your presentation, also building off of Krishna's question. Sort of three themes for me stood out. One was just the finding meaning, something meaningful or a meaningful role, which kind of speaks back to some of the four steps of a recovery. And then the second thing for me is the importance of resiliency as people deal with past traumas, current traumas, and like you said, that will continue, is that resiliency that helps them to deal or face that trauma in ways that allows them to explore some of the core gifts or the protective factors I think we'll discuss next week. And then the third thing, as I see these images on the screen, is the reopening, which could be the recovery, or at least that we might see that as a recovery in trying to return to what life used to be, whether it's the old normal or new normal. And so not so much a question, but more of a reaction that those three themes come from, at least stand out for me. I'm not sure what they mean, but I think that for resiliency, it is important that that we look at what are some of the strengths that we have as individuals within ourselves that we can possibly tap into in terms of dealing with either current mental health issues or mental health issues that may be coming up, as Krishna mentioned, once the pandemic is behind us, what that recovery might look like for us individually and also as communities.
Thanks for those comments, Gustavo. I think we have a tendency to look at bad things and say, we got to get rid of them, or how do I fix them? Rather than how do I learn from my suffering, or how do we grow from it, or how does it help show me what's really meaningful? What lessons was, at one time it used to be a popular thing to say, what lessons is God trying to give me through this? What am I supposed to be learning or changing about things? Or even in a psychoanalytic way of, you've got the same, life's giving you the same lesson over and over again until you learn what it's about. And although this is a shared event, this giant pandemic, how individuals are struggling and what you're struggling with yourself may be real different, and can show you either your strengths, wait, I'm not having any big problem with that at all, hardly, and can also show you your weakness as well. That's really tough for me. But it's almost like any other cross-cultural thing. When you go into a different environment that brings out different aspects of you, we've been in a different culture the last few months. It may feel like my normal home in normal America, but this is not our normal culture to be doing things this way. And it's brought out different things in ourselves. Sometimes we've tried the same old ways of dealing with things without realizing we're dealing with different things along the way. And I think as things go on, and especially people grow and develop, one of the things that makes you most resilient, besides having protective factors like we talked about the first week, is being adaptive. To be able to be self-reflective. What did I notice about myself through this? Don't get harsh and judgmental and self-punitive. What did I notice? What can I build? What are my strengths? What meaning can I take from this, either personally or as a country along the way? Because we're going to have to sooner or later face climate change as a much bigger thing than this pandemic. And how about the three things on this slide and how that's going to affect climate change? I want to be free, I want to be involved with social movements, and I want to be irresponsible. How are those going to go for doing something about keeping our planet livable along the way? It's telling us different things about ourselves, both individually and as a culture, as we go through this.
Okay, well, I don't see any additional questions. Once again, all of our 4 webinars are being recorded, and they will be made available at the Cal-HOSA website. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. Our last webinar will be next Monday, same time, 1 to 2 p.m. And the title of that webinar is Coming Back Stronger. We will explore or help you try to identify or develop what your core gifts are in moving forward and facing this pandemic. You know, there is one more question. And here we go. So Mark, Prishna asks, you had mentioned on an earlier webinar about how we'll see mental health cases increase coming out of this pandemic. How exactly will mental health professionals be equipped to handle these new cases?
So first comment is, I've been looking around to see if I was right. Has there actually been an increase in cases? Especially, I was looking for, is there actually an increase in suicides? And unfortunately, data lags. It's like, you know, trying to get it's even worse than trying to get coronavirus testing data is, well, how many suicides did we have this month compared to last month or stuff. But part of me is wondering if there actually has been an increase, or if we started worrying about that happen and we actually focused on things and we actually made a difference. Lots of times people worry more about things that we end up handling things that we didn't think we'd be able to handle. I'm actually very interested in whether this question turns out to be true, what I said from the very beginning. Do we have an increase in mental health? The mental health professionals will handle it likely predominantly in an illness-centered way, like we handle everything. We'll go around diagnosing depression, anxiety. I think I did read somewhere where there was a bunch of new prescriptions given out for anti-anxiety pills and Prozacs and new diagnosis of anxiety. Although the numbers of people coming to mental health professionals, including me, I think is generally somewhat down, but that's because of the distancing and the fear of getting infected and having to do things online and factors like that. I don't know if that's a reflection of whether the distress is actually up or down. But one of the points I was trying to make in that first webinar was, if we deal with this in the normal way, we're going to be in trouble. If we wait for mental health professionals to make diagnoses and give treatments for as though all this is illnesses, our system will get worn down and won't be able to handle this. We need much more adaptive from many more people involved. And that's why you've seen me coming up with a whole bunch of things here that don't require any professional involvement. Not that some people won't get to the point their distress does actually need professional involvement, but I think we can do things that help keep ourselves better so you won't get there, because I don't expect the amount of mental health professionals to go up any. If anything, it's like the rest of social services, it goes with the state budget, and our budget's going to be going down some. It usually, with mental health services, go backwards like this. When we go through a serious recession, we have less services, and our economy does better, we have more services, because mental health is not a supply and demand. How much mental health we have in the public sector depends upon the funding available and the political climate and the will and whatever else we're paying attention to. It is interesting to me that we have been paying so much attention to mental health and worrying about this along the way as this is happening, but I don't expect that to actually be translated into more professional care being available. So that's why I brought that up in the first one, because I don't think the professionals are going to take over on this.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Krishna. Great. Well, with that, we are at 1:59, and again, thank you so much for joining us. Hope to have you next week. And Mark, any last minute remarks?
I just I would encourage you guys to come next week, because I'm going to try to be much more creative and open. Maybe we'll even have some time for some, if we can make the equipment work, for some breakout groups to think about where things are going in the future, and a little less of the more kind of how-to stuff that we've been doing these couple weeks. So for those of you who'd like to be more creative and thoughtful, show up next week. If you want to be real practical, you probably like this one better.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Great. Thank you all.
All right. Bye-bye, everyone.